Okay, we are reading Oliver Twist, and we are on chapter 17, Sykes' Last Stand. After murdering Nancy, Sykes sat for many hours gazing at her body. When it was dawn, he got up and he lit a fire. He then threw the blood-stained club into the fire. Slowly he washed the blood from his clothes. He was a murderer, and he dare not stay there any longer. So he set out with his dog, and he walked for miles. He walked out of London, and he walked to the countryside. His dog walked behind him. That night he reached the town where he wanted to stop and rest. Near the post office stood a small mail coach. People gathered around it and were discussing a murder in London. Sykes thought it was not a safe town for a murderer, so he decided to go back to London. He wanted to lose himself among the crowd in the city. He could perhaps get some money from Fagin and escape to France. He wished to get rid of his dog, since people could identify him easily as the man with the dog. He tried to tie a noose around the dog's throat and drown him in a pond. But the dog sensed danger and ran away from him. Good for the dog. He's a mean man. Sykes continued his journey. In one of his most miserable areas of London, close to the Thames River, there was a place called Jacob's Island. A 20-foot wide muddy ditch surrounded it, and when the tide came in, water about 6 to 8 feet deep filled the ditch. A broken old house overlooked it. It was the house. In the house sat Toby Crackit and Charlie Bates. Suddenly they heard a noise. It was Bill Sykes' dog that came jumping through a window. Hungry and thirsty, the dog was at the verge of dying. Toby and Charlie gave the dog some water. They saw the dog and wondered if Sykes would come too. Some time later, Sykes also entered, throwing the door open. His face was pale and his eyes looked hollow. "Monster murderer!" they shouted at him. By the time people and horses were approaching the house, Harry Maylie's voice could be heard from among the crowd. 20 guineas to the man who can bring a ladder," Sykes cried. "Give me a rope. I will climb up to the roof and lower myself into the ditch." Then Sykes climbed the roof and tied one end of the rope tightly around the chimney, and he made a loop with the other rope. He would go down holding the rope and then cut it with the sharp-edged knife when he reached the ground, thus prepared to save himself and escape. He put the loop over his head and was going to put it under his armpits when his foot lost balance and he fell off the roof. He fell 35 feet while the loop tightened around his neck and strangled him. Wow, this is a pretty gruesome chapter too. There was a sudden jerk, and the noose now held the murderer's throat so tightly, so firmly, that he hanged lifeless against the wall. His stiff hand was still holding the sharp-edged knife. That was the end of Bill Sykes, who had murdered Nancy. I can't say as I'm sad about that, though. And that's the end of chapter 17.